She was 53 years old, and she had $63 in her coat pocket when she backed out of her own driveway at 3 in the morning. 24 years of marriage, and she left without waking the dog. She drove north on the state road for nearly 2 hours, past the closed truck stops and the dark farmhouses and the Christmas lights somebody on County Road 7 still hadn't taken down. And when the car started shuddering and pulling left on a back road outside a small town called Millhaven, she rolled it to the shoulder and let the engine tick down to quiet. Down through the bare slope of trees below the road, she could make out a structure. Low, rectangular, a cabin. The roof had a sag in the middle that looked like it had been holding its breath for years. One window was dark and cracked and patched on the inside with cardboard. She could see even from the road that nobody was home. What she would find when she went inside would take her the better part of a year to fully understand. If you're settling in for this one, I'm glad you're here. Hitting subscribe keeps these stories coming, and it only takes a second. Drop a line in the comments too. I always want to know where people are watching from. Now, back to Maggie. Margaret Whitfield had gone back to her maiden name in her own head years before she ever said it out loud to anyone. She had married David Calloway in the summer of 1999 when she was 29 in a church in her hometown in front of 112 guests. And she had believed, standing there in her mother's borrowed pearl earrings, that this was the beginning of something good and stable. David was organized, reliable. He worked in project management for a civil engineering firm, and he had a quality she mistook, for a long time, for steadiness. A way of always seeming to hold some piece of information just a half step beyond her reach, as though the world were a meeting he had already attended without her. She had told herself in those early years that this was what a solid man looked like, that she would grow into it. She did not grow into him. She grew around him, the way a tree grows around a fence post, slow, accommodating, and fundamentally altered. They never had children. This had not been any single decision. It had been a long series of conversations that David always managed to reschedule. Next year, let's get through this first. It's not really the right time. Until it simply wasn't a possibility anymore. He absorbed this fact with a small shrug one evening and went back to what he was reading. She had cried alone in the bathroom that same night. She did not mention it again. She had worked as an office administrator for a dental practice for 12 years. She was good at it. She liked the order of scheduling, the small kindnesses she could do for patients who were afraid. Then one evening over dinner, David had suggested, thoughtfully, that it might be easier for both of them if she didn't have to manage all that. He said it like he was offering her something. She gave 2 weeks' notice the following month, and had not worked outside the home since. He did not raise his voice. This was the thing she always struggled to explain to the few people she told. He did not shout. He did not break things. He controlled the thermostat. He reviewed the grocery receipts every Sunday evening. He had a way of receiving something she'd said with a silence that lasted just long enough to make her feel she'd embarrassed herself in front of a room full of people, even when they were alone. When her mother died in a hospice room on a Sunday morning in May of 2019, David sat beside her at the graveside service and checked his phone twice during the reading. He kept the screen angled away and the brightness low. But she saw. She always saw. The final breaking point, when it came, was not dramatic. It never is, with men like David. It was a Tuesday evening in December, 3 weeks before she left, and she had asked, for the third time that month, whether they might go away somewhere for a few days. Anywhere, just the two of them. She hadn't left the county in 14 months. He looked at her over the top of his laptop with an expression she knew well. Patient, faintly tired. "That's not really something we need to be spending on right now," he said, and looked back at his screen. She stood in the kitchen for a very long time after that, looking at her own reflection in the dark window above the sink. She packed on a Saturday afternoon 2 weeks later while he was at his brother's. One duffel bag, her good wool coat, her documents, social security card, passport, the slim folder of financial papers that contained almost nothing in her name, and $63 she had set aside from the grocery money over 4 months, $3 and $5 at a time, tucked in an envelope at the back of the kitchen drawer. She shoved the bag under the bed and told herself she needed more time. She needed a plan. She did not make a plan. She lay awake beside him for 14 more nights, and then one Tuesday, at 2:45 in the morning, she got up and went to the kitchen and made a cup of coffee and drank it standing at the sink, looking at the dark glass. Then she got her coat. Then she got her bag. She found the dog in the front hallway. He was already standing, tail going slow the way it did when he sensed something. She crouched down and scritched behind his ears. He leaned into her hand. She let go, stood up, and backed the car out of the driveway with the headlights off so the bedroom window would stay dark. She drove north. She didn't have a destination. She took the state road and kept going, past the exit for the airport, past the town where she'd gone to college, past a farm stand closed for winter with a hand-lettered sign that read open in April. She drove until the car began to shudder and pull, and she recognized the particular wrongness of a tire going soft on a dark road at 40 miles an hour with $63 to her name. She rolled to the shoulder. She sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel. She looked at the dashboard. She got out. The road was empty. Cold, January cold, the kind that gets into the ears immediately. She stood looking at the front left tire, which had gone entirely flat, and then she looked at what was ahead of her. Nothing. Fields, trees darkened below the grade of the road, down through the bare poplars, a shape. Low, rectangular, a cabin. She got her duffel bag from the back seat. She locked the car, a habit she couldn't help, and walked down the frozen slope through the grass. The cabin was smaller than it had seemed from above. One main room, a sleeping area behind a partial wall, a lean-to addition on the south side with a rusted wood stove and a section of stovepipe that had come partially loose from the ceiling collar. The front step was soft underfoot, rotted through underneath. The door was padlocked with a hasp, but the hasp had pulled halfway free of the old wood on one side. She looked at it for a moment. She pulled the hasp the rest of the way out of the doorframe with both hands and pushed the door open. Inside, the air smelled of old ash and something faint and sweet like dried cedar or lavender. It was dark and cold, but out of the wind. There was a table, a wooden chair, the wood stove. On the table sat a coffee mug with a rooster painted on the side, still there as though someone had just stepped out for a moment and expected to come back. She sat down in the chair. She was 53 years old. She had $63 and a flat tire, and a duffel bag and a padlock she'd pulled out of a stranger's door frame to get through a door that was not hers. She put her head down on her folded arms, and she did not cry. She had thought she might. She was too tired. She was simply, entirely, deeply tired. She slept there, at the table, and woke before the light. The cabin looked different in the gray of early morning. The walls were solid, old-growth wood, thick and dense, holding even where the ceiling showed dark water stains and one corner had bubbled plaster from a long-ago leak. Whoever had built this had built it to last. She could see that even through the years of neglect. There was still firewood stacked against the back wall. Not much, but some. A box of long matches on the shelf above the lean-to stove. She got a fire going after 3 tries and sat close to it until her hands stopped shaking. There were a few things still in the cabin. A wool blanket folded on the cot in the sleeping area. 3 cans in the low cabinet, 2 of tomatoes, 1 of white beans, and a cast-iron pot hung on a hook above the counter. A low bookshelf with a row of paperback mysteries, and a Bible and a cloth-bound journal. And on the open journal, a pair of reading glasses, sitting there as though they'd been set down mid-page and never picked back up. Those glasses stopped her. She stood looking at them and understood for the first time fully that this had been someone's home. Not an empty structure, not an abandoned building, a home. Recently enough that the glasses were still there, lenses turned toward the last page she'd read. She walked to town. 4 miles on a frozen road, and her left foot was complaining before she was halfway there. But she walked. Millhaven was small enough that she could see the whole of it from the top of the rise before she came down into it. A gas station, a diner, a 2-story brick building with county offices upstairs and a real estate office below. She went to the diner first because she was cold and needed to think. The woman who brought her coffee was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved like someone who had been doing this their entire life. She refilled Maggie's cup without being asked. After a while, she slid into the booth across from her. The way a person does when they have decided something is their business, whether you've invited them or not. "Passing through?" she said. Maggie looked at her. She thought about saying yes, which was what she would have said a year ago. Their business was their business, David always said. And then she said, "I don't know yet." The woman's name was Ruth Avery. She had lived in Millhaven her entire life, except for 6 years in a textile mill outside Asheville. She owned the diner now, which had been her mother's. She was 69 years old, and she had the kind of face that made it easy to say things you hadn't planned on saying. Maggie told her about the cabin. Not everything. Enough that she'd found it the night before, that someone had lived there, that she didn't know who it belonged to now. Ruth listened to all of it without interrupting, and then she said, quietly, "That's Eleanor Hatch's place." She said the name the way you say someone's name when you've been thinking about them lately, like it still meant something. Eleanor Hatch had died the previous February, 77 years old, a widow of 12 years, no children. She had lived alone in that cabin for nearly 40 years. Ruth had known her since they were girls, had played in the creek behind the Hatch property together, had checked on her in her later years, brought groceries when the road was bad in winter. Eleanor's nephew up in Vermont, her sister's boy, a man named Gary, had been informed of the death and had declined the property without ever coming to look at it. The county had been sitting on the tax situation since. Maggie set down her coffee cup. "What do you mean, the tax situation?" Ruth explained what she knew. Eleanor's property taxes hadn't been paid since she died. The county had a process for delinquent parcels, an 18-month window during which someone could pay what was owed and make a claim. After that, it went to auction. How much is owed? Lord, I'm not sure exactly. It's a small parcel, maybe $300–400 behind. Eleanor always paid in January. Maggie was quiet for a moment. "What month is it?" she said, mostly to herself. "January," said Ruth. She waited, with the patience of someone who has learned to let people find their own way to what they're already thinking. Maggie went to the county office that afternoon. The clerk was a man named Leonard Briggs, perhaps 60, with the careful, unhurried manner of someone who has spent a career processing paperwork while people were upset. He pulled up the hatch file without much expression. 11 acres, one structure, delinquent taxes of $341 for the previous calendar year. She had $63. Leonard Briggs looked at her. She looked at him. She told him she didn't have it right now, but she was asking. She wanted him to know she was asking, and she would be back. He stamped something and wrote something on a small card and handed it to her. "Nobody else has come in," he said. "As of today, you've got time." She walked back out into the cold and stood on the sidewalk. She looked at her car, which she'd left on the shoulder of a back road with a flat tire, and which, she realized, was the only asset she had in the world. It was a 2018 Subaru with 140,000 miles on it, and the registration was in her name because she had always handled the registration because David didn't like dealing with it. She could sell the car. She could pay the taxes. She could move into a dead woman's cabin in January and figure the rest out from there. It was a gamble. Everything about this was a gamble. She called a tow truck from the payphone outside the gas station. Had the car towed to a mechanic in town named Pete, who confirmed the flat and a brake line that also needed attention, and she asked him whether he knew anyone who might buy a Subaru in fair to good condition. Pete said he might know a guy. Pete's guy paid her $3,200 for the car 3 days later, which was less than it was worth and more than she needed. She paid the delinquent taxes on a Thursday morning. $341 in cash to Leonard Briggs, who gave her a receipt and a form and told her the transfer process would take 8 to 10 weeks. She moved into the cabin that afternoon with her duffel bag and her coat. She boiled white beans in Eleanor's cast iron pot and ate them at Eleanor's table with a spoon she found in the kitchen drawer, beside a butter knife and a can opener and a folded slip of paper. The handwriting on it was careful and deliberate, the kind taught in schools a generation earlier. She unfolded it. The door's always open for someone who needs it. She read it twice. She set it back on the table where she'd found it. She spent the first 2 weeks on the most urgent things. There was a propane heater in the lean-to storage room that still functioned, and she got 2 tanks from the hardware store in town. The roof leaked only in the far corner of the main room, and she put Eleanor's stock pot there and emptied it twice through the first rain. She found a spare mattress folded against the storage wall, musty but sound, and dragged it onto the cot. She swept. She hauled ash. She caulked around the window frames with a tube she found in the storage shelves beside a jar of nails and a folded tarpaulin. Ruth brought food. She didn't ask first. She showed up on the 3rd day with a container of vegetable soup and a pan of cornbread, set them on the table, and looked around the cabin with a particular private expression. "I haven't been up here since the funeral," she said, softly. "I hope it's all right," Maggie said. "That I'm here." "I know it's not." "Eleanor would have liked it," Ruth said, in the gentle way of someone who has heard enough unnecessary apologies. She would have liked it very much. Her eyes rested on the note lying on the table. "Did she leave that out?" "It was in the drawer," Maggie said. Ruth nodded slowly. "That sounds like her." Over the following weeks, Ruth told her about Eleanor in pieces, over coffee at the diner and eventually at the cabin table itself. About how Eleanor had grown up poor, married Ed Hatch in her 20s, and been widowed at 44 when Ed had a heart attack in the wood yard on a cold morning, not unlike this one. About her own family expecting her to sell the half-built cabin and the raw land and move in with a relative somewhere. One of her brothers had made an offer, far below what it was worth, and when she'd refused, he stopped speaking to her. About Eleanor building the cabin the rest of the way herself, with 2 friends from the county extension office and whatever she could source or barter. about her working as a bookkeeper for 33 years to pay the taxes and the supplies and to put a little away. She was the most self-sufficient person I have ever known, Ruth said. And the most quietly generous. She grew more food than she could eat, and she always found somewhere for the rest of it. In the bad winters, she'd leave things on people's porches. She gave rides to appointments without being asked. She kept a key under the mat. Ruth's voice was fond and a little sad. She had a saying. Said it so often you almost stopped hearing it. The door's always open for someone who needs it. She put a lantern in the window on bad nights, so people on the road could see there was a house if they needed one. Maggie held this for a moment. She looked at the note on the table. Then, she looked out the window at the dark road. She was 2 weeks into this life, 2 weeks into this borrowed quiet, when she found the loose board. I want to stop here for just a moment. If you're staying with this story and finding something in it, I'd love to have you subscribe. It keeps these coming to you, and it costs nothing but a second. Keep the comments coming too. I read more of them than you'd probably expect. Now, the loose board. It was in the sleeping room, under the far edge of the cot. She had been sweeping when the broom handle caught an edge and the plank shifted. She crouched down. The board was perhaps 18 inches long, and it was not nailed. It was simply resting in its groove, as though it had been designed to come up. She worked it loose with both hands. Underneath was a shallow space, maybe 8 inches deep. In the space were 3 coffee tins, old ones, the kind with hand-soldered seams, the lithographed labels faded to soft reds and blues. She lifted them out one at a time. They were heavy. Each tin was packed with rolled bills, bundled with rubber bands gone stiff and sticky with age. 50s, 100s, some 20s. She sat on the floor for a long time before she opened the first one. She counted it twice. $4,800. She counted the second. $6,200. She counted the third. She sat on the floor of Eleanor Hatch's cabin with $31,400 in used bills laid out around her in the late afternoon light, and she put both hands over her mouth. And she did not move for a very long time. She did not touch the money for 3 days. She put it all back in the tins. She put the tins back in the space. She replaced the board and pushed the cot so its edge covered it. And she went about her days, sweeping, hauling, patching, and she told herself she needed to understand what this was before she did anything about it. She went to see Leonard Briggs. She did not tell him about the money. She asked him, as evenly as she could manage, whether Eleanor Hatch had left a will. Leonard looked at her over his reading glasses with the measured expression of a man who has seen a great many things and filed them all correctly, and he said, as a matter of fact, yes. He brought out the file. Eleanor had prepared a handwritten will, notarized by a Millhaven attorney, 2 years before her death. It was simple. The property and its contents were to go to the first woman who claimed shelter in the cabin after Eleanor's passing, provided she could demonstrate genuine need and had paid the delinquent taxes. Gary, the nephew in Vermont, had been informed of this clause before Eleanor died and had declined the property accordingly. Leonard had been waiting for someone to come in. Maggie read the will twice. Then she said, she knew someone would come. She believed someone would, Leonard said. He took his glasses off and set them on the desk. She told me, when she filed this, that she'd been that someone herself once, a long time ago. She said she just wanted to make sure the door stayed open. Maggie drove back to the cabin. She had bought a used truck from Pete for $800, a 2005 Ford with high miles and a reliable engine, and she sat at Eleanor's table in the fading light. She held the note she'd found in the drawer. The door's always open for someone who needs it. She had been thinking of it as a nice sentiment. The philosophy of a good woman, written on a scrap of paper and left in a drawer. It was not a sentiment. It was a promise Eleanor had spent 2 years making legally binding, and 33 years before that making real. Over the following weeks, as word got quietly around Millhaven that someone had moved into the Hatch place, people came. Not many, and not intrusively. An older man named Harper arrived with a splitting maul and 2 cords of firewood, stacked them against the cabin wall without being asked, and said that Eleanor had always kept a cord on his side of the fence for when his back was bad. A woman from the church knocked with a casserole and asked if she needed anything from the hardware store because her husband was going anyway. A retired school teacher named Doris walked the full property line with her, explaining which fence posts were original and which Ed had replaced, pointing out the spring-fed well and the path to the creek. Maggie found the ledger 3 weeks after she found the tins. It was in a cigar box on the highest shelf, tucked behind a row of seed catalogs. Eleanor had kept records, meticulous, small-handed records, of every dollar in and out for 40 years. The money in the tins was savings, accumulated slowly from her bookkeeping income, and from the sale of firewood and honey and handmade quilts, a few $100s at a time, year over year over year. Eleanor had kept it in cash, not because she distrusted banks, but because she liked to know it was there, within reach. The way a door is within reach. Inside the back cover of the ledger, folded carefully, was a property record. 11 acres. Clear title. No liens. The woodlot running down to the creek and the kitchen garden, and the well and the old smokehouse at the back of the property, which Maggie had taken for a ruin, but which turned out to have a floor of soundstone and walls that needed only repointing. She had $31,000 and 11 acres, and the will of a woman she had never met, who had understood her situation before she arrived. She sat with all of this for a while. Then she got up and went to work. By March, the ground was soft enough to turn, and she had read enough of Eleanor's seed catalog margins, careful, personal annotations in pencil, notes on which varieties did well in the slope drainage, and which needed more than the light gave them on the north side, to plant Eleanor's beds in Eleanor's order. Onions and peas and lettuces first, then tomatoes and squash, the same seed house Eleanor had ordered from for 20 years. Harper came up and helped her repair the fence line. Doris drove her to the county library to get a card. Pete's teenage son came with Pete on a Saturday, and they replaced the stovepipe section in the lean-to. She fed them lunch. It felt strange at first, feeding people in this life that was still forming itself around her. And then it felt necessary, and then it felt simply like what you did. Leonard Briggs processed the transfer of title in April. She paid the filing fees from Eleanor's money. She sat in his office and signed her name, Whitfield, Margaret, her maiden name, fully restored, on the deed to 11 acres in Millhaven County, and she understood that this was the most real thing she had done in 20 years. She started part-time bookkeeping work at the county extension office in May. They had lost their administrator to retirement and posted the position locally without expecting much. Maggie had 12 years of office administration and 4 months of reading Eleanor Hatch's ledgers, which were a masterclass in precision. She started the first Monday of the month. She did not think about David often. When she did, it was with a strange, flat distance. Not anger. Not grief exactly. More like the faint surprise of passing through a town you used to live in and not being able to remember the smell of your own kitchen there. His letter came in June, forwarded through her sister's address to her post office box in town. 2 pages, handwritten. She had never seen his handwriting on more than a grocery list. He said he hadn't expected this. He said he'd had time to think. He said he recognized some things now that he hadn't before, and that things could be different, and that he missed having her there. She read it once, all the way through, the way she had learned to read important documents, carefully, without letting the feeling get ahead of the words. Then she folded it in half, and folded it again, and put it in the wood stove. She did not feel triumphant. She felt clean. The way the cabin felt when she swept the ash and opened the windows and the April air came through the rooms. She heard through her sister, later that summer, that David had mentioned to people they knew that she had apparently gotten herself a property somewhere up north. That he had said this in a way that was meant to sound unconcerned and did not quite manage it. Her sister laughed, telling her. Maggie laughed too. And then she went back to what she'd been doing, which was more interesting. By July, the kitchen garden was producing more than she could use, and she found herself leaving bags of tomatoes and cucumbers on her neighbors' porches, the way Eleanor had left things on porches for 30 years before her. She kept a pot of soup on the stove most Sundays and left the door unlocked. She cleaned Eleanor's old kerosene lamp, the one from the shelf in the sleeping room, filled it, and set it in the window on dark evenings so its light reached the road. Not for any practical reason, just because it seemed right. Just because Eleanor had done it, and Eleanor had understood something that Maggie was still learning, that the door you leave open for someone else is the same door you once needed someone to leave open for you. Ruth noticed the lamp one evening, sitting at the table with her hands around a mug. She went quiet for a moment. Then she said softly, "Eleanor used to do that." She nodded at the window. "I know," said Maggie. Eleanor's reading glasses were still on the shelf. Maggie had bought her own pair at the drugstore in town. They were almost the same shape, and she had set them beside the journal, which she had read slowly over many weeks, treating it with the care of something valuable, which it was. The last entry in the journal was dated 6 weeks before Eleanor's death. 3 short lines. Did the south fence post. Pickles are done. Good day. Maggie had thought about those 3 lines for months. The particular satisfaction of a good day that doesn't need explaining, that doesn't need to be witnessed by anyone to count. Her own days had begun to feel that way. She had a home. She had work. She had neighbors who knocked on the door and a wood lot she walked every morning, and a kitchen garden and a lantern in the window and a name that was fully her own, and she had come to understand something she could not have understood before that 3 a.m. When she backed out of her own driveway in the dark, the things that look like falling are sometimes just the way forward, arriving faster than you expected. She had driven away from a house with $63 and a bag and a flat tire on a cold road, and she had found a door that had been left open for her, left open on purpose, by a woman who had once needed the same thing and who had spent 30 years and every dollar she saved making sure the next person could walk through it. The door's always open for someone who needs it. Eleanor had meant it as a promise. Maggie was learning to mean it the same way. If this story stayed with you, I hope you'll subscribe. It keeps these stories coming, and it helps more than you'd think. And I'd love to hear from you. Was there ever a moment when something you were afraid of turned out to lead somewhere better? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. See you in the next one.